Okay, let's dive into this stack of sources you've shared. They're all focused on, well, a really pivotal time, the birth and early years of democracy in India right after independence.
That's right. We're looking at that period when India made this pretty remarkable choice, going for full electoral democracy straight away.
Even when so many predicted it just couldn't work.
Exactly. And within that, how one particular party came to dominate the political scene so completely in those early days.
Right. So our mission here, just sticking to the material we have in front of us, is to really understand the sheer challenge and I guess the eventual success of setting up those first free and fair elections, and also why the Indian National Congress was so dominant, overwhelmingly so, in that foundational era.
And what role the other parties, the opposition, played, even if they weren't winning many seats initially.
Got it. So context first. Independent India, these sources make it clear, faced just enormous challenges. Nation building was a massive task, especially after partition.
Yeah, the trauma of partition was huge. And, many other countries becoming independent around then took different routes.
Simpler routes, maybe, like one-party rule or military control?
Often, yes. Prioritizing national unity, perhaps, over the potential conflicts that democracy might bring up.
But India's leaders, well, they were forged in the freedom struggle, weren't they? They saw democracy differently.
They did. They saw it as the actual tool, the essential way to navigate those challenges, not an obstacle.
And they moved fast. Constitution adopted November 49.
Signed January 50, came into effect straight away.
And the very next step was getting that first elected government in place.
Which meant building the machinery. So the Election Commission of India was set up January 1950. Sukumar Sen, the first chief election commissioner.
You can really sense the mindset in what the leaders were saying at the time.
Yeah, like that quote from B.R. Ambedkar in the sources.
Yeah.
Warning against hero worship in politics.
Right, calling it a sure road to degradation and eventual dictatorship.
It shows they were really conscious of, how fragile democracy could be.
Okay, let's unpack the first general election itself, because this was huge. Not quick either.
No, definitely not. The sources say it was initially thought maybe a few months. But the reality of organizing free, fair elections across India,
the size, the diversity.
It was just incredibly complex, unprecedented really anywhere in the world back then.
So what were the big tasks?
Two colossal jobs, mainly. First, delimitation, actually drawing the boundaries for all the electoral constituencies.
Mapping it all out.
And second, preparing the electoral rolls, the lists of who could actually vote. Meticulous work.
And there's that detail in the sources about the women's names that really stands out.
Oh, yeah. During the voter list preparation, they found nearly 4 million women whose names weren't properly recorded.
Just listed as wife of or daughter of.
Exactly. And the Election Commission, to their credit, they put their foot down, said, no, this isn't acceptable.
What did they do?
Ordered revisions, insisted on proper names, or those entries would just be deleted. It shows that a foundational work, getting the basics right from the very beginning.
And the scale, just the numbers.
It's staggering. 17 crore eligible voters, that's 170 million people.
Electing thousands of state assembly members, MLAs, and nearly 500 Lok Sabha members for the national parliament.
And remember, this is in a country where only about 15% of those people could read or write.
Which brings us to the voting method itself. How do they handle that?
Well, that low literacy rate posed a huge practical problem. So the solution, according to the sources, was really innovative.
Not just marking a ballot paper.
No, voters got a blank ballot paper. And in the polling booth, there was a separate box for each candidate.
Okay.
Each box had the candidate's unique symbol on it. You just dropped your blank ballot into the box of the candidate or the symbol you chose.
Wow, simple but effective. The logistics must have been immense.
Oh, incredible. The sources mentioned something like 2 million steel boxes had to be made.
2 million?
Yeah. And there's a quote from a presiding officer in Punjab describing just setting up one polling booth, preparing the boxes, sticking on the symbols, names in different languages, sealing them. Hours of work for several people.
It really paints a picture. And all this massive undertaking, it wasn't universally praised, was it?
Not at all. Deep skepticism. The sources quote an Indian editor calling it the biggest gamble in history.
Right. And Organizer magazine predicting failure.
And that British ICS official dismissing it as an absurd farce.
They genuinely didn't think democracy could take root in a country facing such poverty and illiteracy.
They really didn't. But then came 1952, and the election actually happened.
Well, it was held over several months, right? Up to 51 to Feb 52.
Yes, postponed twice. But most voting was in January 52, so it's generally called the 1952 election. Took about 6 months start to finish.
And was it competitive?
Very. The sources say, on average, more than 4 candidates for every seat. So real choices.
And did people turn out?
Encouragingly high participation. More than half the eligible voters actually came out and cast their ballot.
That's pretty amazing given the circumstances.
It really is. And maybe the most crucial thing, the results were accepted as fair.
Even by those who lost.
Even by the losers. That acceptance was absolutely key for legitimacy.
So it proved the doubters wrong.
Profoundly wrong. The sources quote the Times of India saying the polls confounded all those skeptics.
And the Hindustan Times called it the largest experiment in democratic elections in the history of the world.
It really was a landmark. It showed democracy could work, even with widespread poverty and illiteracy.
A huge moment for India and for democracy globally, really.
Absolutely. Now, while the election itself was a triumph for democracy, the results ushered in something else. This era of one-party dominance.
Right, the Congress Party. It wasn't exactly a surprise they won, was it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
They carried that huge legacy of the freedom struggle. They were seen as the natural inheritors.
But the scale of the win in 52, that was something else.
It really was. In that first Lok Sabha election, Congress won 364 out of 489 seats.
Wow. And the next biggest party?
The Communist Party of India, the CPI, they got just 16 seats.
A massive gap.
Huge. And this wasn't just at the national level. The state elections happened at the same time.
And Congress won most of those too.
Majorities in almost all states. They formed governments pretty much everywhere, though there were a couple of initial exceptions like Travancore, Cochin, Madras, Orissa.
Yeah.
But eventually they formed governments there too.
So Jawaharlal Nehru becomes prime minister, leading a dominant Congress nationally and in most states.
Mm-hmm. And this wasn't just a one-off. The sources show this pattern continued. In the next 2 general elections, 1957 and 1962.
Same story.
Pretty much. Congress kept winning around 3/4 of the Lok Sabha seats, the opposition parties combined. They were getting less than 1/10 of the seats Congress held.
So you have this overwhelming one-party rule. But the sources emphasize this was different from, say, other one-party states.
That's the really critical point here. This Congress dominance happened under democratic conditions. Meaning within a system with free and fair elections. Contested by multiple parties. It wasn't like China or Cuba, where only one party is even allowed.
Or other places using the military or laws to suppress opposition.
Exactly. Not like Myanmar or Belarus or Egypt back then. India's situation was different. Maybe some parallels to historical periods in Mexico or South Korea or Taiwan, where one party was effectively dominant for a long time. But India arguably had more open contestation from the start.
Okay, so if it wasn't force or legal bans, why was Congress so incredibly successful in this democratic setup? The sources point to a few things.
Yeah, several factors came together. One undoubtedly was that freedom movement legacy we mentioned. They were seen as the party that won independence.
National heroes leading it.
Absolutely. Plus, they just had a massive head start organizationally.
First off, the blocks, as the source says.
Right. While other parties were still forming or were just regional, Congress already had this structure, nationwide down to the villages.
But maybe the most interesting reason, according to the sources, is the nature of Congress itself. It wasn't just one single ideology.
No, it was deliberately built as this incredibly broad coalition, socially and ideologically.
The sources call it a rainbow.
Yeah, bringing together really diverse groups. Peasants, industrialists, urban folk, rural folk, workers, owners, different classes, castes, religions, languages, all sorts of interests.
And ideologically, too.
Hugely diverse. The sources say it accommodated everyone from revolutionary and pacifist, conservative and radical, extremist and moderate, right, left, and all shades of the center. It acted like a big platform.
So internal differences weren't necessarily a weakness.
Quite the opposite in a way. They were managed inside the party. The sources talk about factions, internal groups.
Based on ideology or sometimes just personal rivalries?
Both. And crucially, these factions were tolerated, sometimes even encouraged.
Why was that key?
Because it meant people with different views or ambitions often stayed within Congress to fight their political battles, rather than leaving to form opposition parties.
Ah, so the real competition was often happening inside Congress.
To a large extent, yes. This whole phenomenon is what the sources call the Congress system. The ruling party also kind of contained the main opposition competition internally.
Fascinating. And there's one more factor mentioned, the electoral system itself.
Right, the first-past-the-post system. The system India uses, where the candidate with the most votes in a constituency wins, even if they don't get over 50%.
How did that help Congress?
Well, even when Congress got less than half the total votes across the country, like 45% in 1952, they won a much, much bigger share of the seats. 74% in that election.
Why? Because the anti-Congress votes were split.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The votes against Congress were often divided among several different opposition parties and independent candidates in each local race. So Congress could win the seat with, say, 40% of the vote, while the remaining 60% was split uselessly among losers.
Okay, so Congress dominated, but it's important, based on the sources, to stress that India did have opposition parties.
Oh, absolutely. Diverse and vibrant ones, the sources say. Even more diverse than in many other multi-party democracies at the time.
They just didn't win many seats initially.
Their electoral success was, pretty token at first, but their presence was vital.
How so? What role did they play?
Several key roles. They offered consistent, often principled criticism of the government, kept Congress on its toes.
Check their power a bit.
Yes, and they also influenced the balance of power within those Congress factions we talked about. Different factions might align with or respond to critiques from specific opposition groups.
Okay.
And crucially, they kept the democratic alternative alive. They prevented frustration or resentment from turning anti-democratic because there was a channel for opposition.
And trained future leaders.
Yes, they served as grooming grounds for people who would become major political figures later on.
The sources mention some specific parties. The Communist Party of India, the CPI.
Roots going back to the Bolshevik Revolution's influence. A complex history working within Congress early on, supporting the British in WWII, initially calling independence a sham.
Before participating in elections.
Right. They became the largest opposition party in '52. Strong support in places like Kerala, Andhra, West Bengal. Key leaders mentioned are A.K. Gopalan, E.M.S. Namboodiripad. The party later split in 1964.
Them, a socialist party.
Traced back to the Congress Socialist Party, formed inside Congress in 1934. They believed in democratic socialism, were big critics of Congress.
Faced a dilemma when Congress itself adopted a socialist pattern slogan.
Yeah, that created some confusion. They went through various splits and mergers. Important figures were Jayaprakash Narayan, Ram Manohar, Lohia. Many Kerr parties trace roots back to them.
And the Bharatiya Jana Sangh.
Formed in 1951. Linked in the sources to the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha.
Great platform.
Emphasized one country, one culture, one nation. Opposed English. Opposed concessions to minorities. Advocated for India developing nuclear weapons.
How did they do electorally?
Limited success initially. Found support mainly in urban areas in the Hindi-speaking states. Leaders mentioned include Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, and the sources note the BJP traces its origins here.
And there was some initial respect between these different leaders.
Yes, the sources mentioned that in the very early years, people like Ambedkar, who was law minister, and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee were in Nehru's first cabinet, despite not being Congress members. Nehru even invited socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan to join.
But that changed.
That mutual respect apparently declined as political competition heated up over the years.
Now, this Congress dominance was the general rule, but the sources highlight one really significant exception early on. Kerala in 1957.
Yes, that was a major moment. In the state assembly elections there in 57, the Communist Party, the CPI,
the largest opposition party nationally,
won the largest number of seats in Kerala, 60 out of 126. And they formed a government with the support of 5 independents.
Led by E.M.S. Namboodiripad, who you mentioned earlier.
That's right. And this was historic. The sources state it was the first time anywhere in the world that a communist government had come to power through democratic elections.
Wow. How did the Congress Party, which was dominant everywhere else and at the center, react?
Not well. According to the sources, the Congress Party unit in Kerala launched what they called a liberation struggle against the elected communist government.
A struggle against an elected government.
The CPI claimed this agitation was stirred up by vested interests and religious groups who were against the government's land reforms and other policies.
And what was the final outcome?
This is where it gets quite controversial, as described in the sources. In 1959, the Congress government at the center, Nehru's government, used Article 356 of the Constitution.
That's the one for president's role.
Yes. They dismissed the elected communist government in Kerala.
And the sources say this was seen as?
It's cited in the sources as the very first instance of what many considered a misuse of those constitutional emergency powers. A really significant event showing the tensions within that dominant system.
Okay, so pulling all this together from the sources, This first phase of Indian democracy was really defined by Congress's unique position.
Yeah, its legacy gave it a massive head start.
But it was also its nature, that broad, inclusive coalition managing competition internally, that allowed it to dominate within a democratic framework.
Exactly, the Congress system.
And the sources are clear, this was a phase, as Congress's ability to hold all those diverse interests together changed over time.
The political landscape shifted, and other parties started to gain more ground.
Understanding this foundation, the huge effort of the first elections, the specific nature of Congress dominance, the vital role of even a small opposition, it really helps you grasp how India's multi-party democracy evolved later on.
Absolutely essential context for understanding Indian politics today.
It really sets the scene. So here's a final thought for you. Drawing from everything we've unpacked from these sources, given how important those internal factions and the whole broad church coalition idea were to Congress's early dominance, what does the way party structures and political competition have evolved in India since then tell us about how its democracy itself might be changing? Something to think about.